And so we have a distinguished panel to help us explore these issues. Again, towards the end, we'll have a time for questions as well. But first of all, we have a session with someone who's probably the kind of nation's favourite historian right now. Maybe Dominic Sandbrook might have something to say about that. But I'm delighted to have with us Tom Holland, who many of you will have read his book, Dominion, and we'll be exploring a little bit one or two of the themes on that. So please would you give a warm welcome to Tom Holland.
I've got to say, if Dominic knew that a bishop was praising me as the nation's favourite historian, it would confirm all his darkest suspicions.
Well, there you go.
Please, nobody tell him.
Okay. Well, you can tell him if you want to. It's all yours.
I will be quiet.
There you go. Nobody else tell him. Good. So, Tom, we've got a half an hour just to kind of have a conversation around the church's role in shaping our national life. And I guess I wanted to begin with a more general question about history. We all know the famous quote by Henry Ford, history is bunk. In fact, the full quote apparently goes like this: history is more or less bunk. It is tradition. We want to live in the present, and the only history that is worth a tinker's cuss is the history that we make today. So there you've got one kind of position, which is kind of saying that actually history doesn't really have a great impact upon the day. What matters really is what we do right now, innovation and so on. The other end of the scale, we've got maybe people who would say, well, actually, we're kind of bound to kind of repeat the mistakes of the past. And I've often noticed, listening to the rest of history, you often draw out the ways in which some of the things and the periods you talk about are kind of reflected in the present. Well, out of that sort of spectrum, just the way into our thing, how do you sort of feel about the way in which history shapes our current life? Are you at one end of the spectrum saying, well, actually, history is past, it's kind of interesting, but doesn't really affect the present? Or are you at the other end of that spectrum to say, well, actually, no, there's a kind of almost inevitable repeating of past patterns?
Well, there's a kind of very opposite statement to Ford's opinion, which was expressed by Fox, as in Fox's Book of Martyrs, who was quoting Cicero, the great Roman orator in the 1st century BC, and quotes Cicero as saying that those who do not know the past are like children. And Fox, of course, is writing with a very intense awareness that history matters crucially, because as a Christian, and more specifically as a Protestant who is in self-conscious opposition to an explanation of the past that he is now in opposition to, so the explanation of the past given by the Roman Church, he wants to believe that history is an expression of God's purpose and of the role played in it by God's church. And so Fox is very committed to the idea that the Reformation is not the expression of something new and radical, as his Catholic opponents would say. And so he, of course, advances the proposition that the Reformation is about a return to the primal standards of the church in its glorious early days. But he's also very committed to the idea that, say, that the Church of England is something that was founded by people back in the Anglo-Saxon period, and that just as people in the 16th century are translating the Bible into English, so the Anglo-Saxons had done the same, and that therefore this is a model of history that does not emphasize the role played by the papacy, Gregory the Great in sending Augustine or whatever, but is it's about native traditions in England that are also the expression of the English Church's communion with God's purposes. And in that sense, I think you could argue that to live in a Christian country is to live in a country with a very profound sense of history. And so the argument over how old the Church of England is, I think a tweet was put out earlier this year saying that the Church of England goes back to whenever, and there was lots of discussion about whether this was correct or not. But I mean, it is a really, really kind of live issue, and it reflects the broader issue that the Christian notion of there being a beginning and an end which is something we tend to take for granted because we're absolutely steeped in it, is a very culturally contingent one. And in that sense, I think that it's really telling that the first great work of history by an English writer, by Bede, is a history of the church in England.
Yeah.
So Ford, he is the expression of a kind of mentality that sees history as being bunk because it is something to be rejected because we live in a new, vibrant industrial age, and that is an understanding of the industrial age that's powerfully informed by Darwinist thinking. But I think that America remains as shaped by a Christian and indeed a Protestant sense of history as England and Britain is.
Yeah, thank you. So there is a sense in which we can't entirely escape history, and as we're looking back into that story, I want to spend a bit of time thinking about a particular period of that history which has been important in shaping our kind of national life. And there's a chapter in your book, Dominion, I think it's the one called Spirit, where you write about Gerard Winstanley, this amazing figure who is a cloth merchant, a smallholder, who starts digging on land that he shouldn't be digging on in St George's Hill, which is now I think some fancy golf club or something like that.
Oh, so he's a proto-communist. Yeah. There's a monument in St Petersburg that was put up when it was Leningrad, and it lists proto-communists who want to be celebrated. And Gerard Winstanley is on it. He's the only English person on this. So he's in the kind of hierarchy of communist saints. Yeah. And there are two brilliant ironies about St George's Hill, where he and his fellow band of diggers occupied. It was kind of public land, and he says that all of earth is God's gift, and therefore it is the common property of all. And this is in the wake of the execution of the king in 1649, and a few months afterwards. And so it's always taken as the expression of that kind of radical explosion of Protestant enthusiasm that follows the execution of the king and the kind of imminent establishment of the Commonwealth. And you can go on a digger's tour around St George's Hill, but you can't actually go onto St George's Hill because it's a gated community, and you can only go there if you're very, very rich. And what makes it even more delicious is the fact that one of the people who had a house on that in the 60s was John Lennon, who imagined no property, no heaven, no religion.
Now you picked that story as part of your account of the kind of Christian formation of our culture. What was it particularly about that story that you wanted to draw out that tells you something about our kind of Christian heritage as a nation and the role of the faith has played in that?
Well, I think that religion lies at the heart of the conflicts that kind of grouped in. It used to be called the English Civil War, now the War of the Three Kingdoms. And when I was studying it at school, it was very much framed as kind of economic. It was a kind of Marxist understanding of it, rise of the gentry, all that kind of thing. It seems to me clearly now that understanding of religion lies at the heart of it. And the Puritan tradition, which is so important in America as well as in England, obviously provides the kind of animating fire for the parliamentary victory, I think. But as always happens in revolutions, those who begin it tend to discover that the revolution is running out of their control. And in that sense, Winstanley is the perfect embodiment of it, because Thomas Fairfax, who was the commander of the victorious parliamentary armies, and is already feeling that the revolution is getting slightly out of control. He famously, his wife at the trial of Charles I had kind of cried out from the balcony that what was happening was wrong, and that Thomas Fairfax wouldn't be a part of it. he goes to see what's going on, and he's kind of mildly interested in it, and he lets them go on, but it's clearly kind of an expression of the division between the commanding heights of the revolution and people down on the ground. And I think Winstanley is the embodiment of this idea that, and the reason that he appears in a chapter called Spirit, that when you read scripture, what matters is what the Spirit is telling you, the fire that is in your heart. Be on the right side of history, all that kind of thing. And I think that Winstanley is a kind of foreshadowing of trends that are still very, very manifest in British society at the moment. His concern for a sense of the entire planet as a gift to all of humanity. I mean, you can see that that's very evident in protests that are ongoing around the environment. And a kind of hostility towards property, towards elites, to channeling into kind of economic understanding of what a society should be, of kind of notions that, the last should be first. What does that mean? And Winstanley's heirs, which is why his name appears on a communist monument in Leningrad, will result in all kinds of trends that may not seem to be overtly Christian, but I think have kind of Christian assumptions kind of in their marrow.
Yeah, you mentioned there the execution of the king, and obviously the Civil War is that period in our history, that great convulsion at a time when you had Roundheads and Cavaliers and different sides of that. And again, one of my questions is, does that still have an ongoing relevance for today in terms of the relationship, particularly to the monarchy, those who are particularly pro and against and so on? Are there still those kind of trends in British society today?
Yeah, I guess that I remember there was a very good thriller by a guy called Anthony Price, who I think lived in Oxford actually, and it was set against the backdrop of a kind of sealed knot battle. Remember the sealed knot kind of restaged Civil War battles, and a Roundhead gets killed in this battle. He turns out to be a kind of a radical Trotskyist, and the Secret Service are all Cavaliers, and there's definitely a sense that, and this was, I think, it was written in the 70s, that the proto-Thatcherites are on the side of the Cavaliers, and the kind of the radical Trotskyites and Marxists are all carrying pikes in the New Model Army. And it sticks in my mind. I must have read it when I was about 12 or 13, but it sticks in my mind because it is an expression of something that I would then go on to find when I read Christopher Hill, great historian of the world turned upside down, wrote a biography of Cromwell and so on, who was a Marxist and who clearly very strongly identified his values and beliefs with the good old cause. Michael Foot would be another example, and Tony Benn. And to that extent, I mean, I don't think that Jeremy Corbyn was as intellectually engaged with the period as Tony Benn and Michael Foot was, but I mean, he's very influenced by them, and so Corbyn's influence on a whole new generation of radicals, I think, suggests that you can trace a line of living descent all the way back.
Yeah, in the sense which civil wars, whenever they happen, they tend to kind of have an ongoing life, whether in the United States or in the UK.
Yeah, and the argument of Dominion is that you don't need to be church-going to be radically shaped by Christian assumptions. And if the Civil War was about basically different understandings of Christianity and what God wants from churches, then do you need me to? Yes, sorry. Is that better? Then the voice will ring out loud and clear. Will not be silenced. What was I saying? I think that the traumas and the issues at stake in the Civil War have had such a seismic impact in shaping the way that we understand the divisions that have persisted throughout our society right the way up into the 21st century, that we can't really understand and with this I would completely concur with Cicero. I'm sure Cicero would be thrilled to know that we can't really understand the present without knowing that the more you kind of immerse yourself in the literature and the polemics and the thinking of the Civil War period, the more it shed lights on the present.
And going on from that, I guess some people have said that the real revolutionary moment in English history was the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the kind of deposition of a sort of Catholic king, and instead the imposition of a Protestant king. And I suppose even still now, when we were reminded of this in the coronation, that the king made these professions of Protestant faith. He was meant to say, I will, to the utmost of my power, maintain in the UK, in the United Kingdom, the Protestant Reformed religion established by law. That was a bit of a surprise when those words were said. And I suppose my question is, do you think that the Protestant character of the monarchy still has any meaning anymore? How Protestant are we as a nation and as a kind of structure?
Well, I think instinctively, psychologically, culturally, we remain very Protestant. And I think that Protestantism recently, because the internet speaks American, means that in a way that cultural Protestantism has been Americanized. And I think you get a sense of how seismic that influence can be when you look at Ireland, a very, very traditionally Catholic country that I think now essentially, its kind of elite ideology is a kind of soft, godless form of cultural Protestantism. So to that extent, I think culturally we do remain Protestant. But I think the great genius, you may well think it's the great tragedy of Christianity, and perhaps particularly Protestant Christianity in the modern period, has been its genius at kind of marketing its insights and its assumptions as being not culturally contingent, but as somehow being universal. So, very Protestant. Oh, have I gone again? Has that gone? No, you can still hear me. Good. Very, very Protestant notions of words like religion, secular. These have been spread across the world. They've gone to India, they've gone to Turkey, whatever. And they are accepted in non-Christian countries on the basis that they are not Christian, but I think that they absolutely are. And to that extent, I think we do remain very Protestant. And the corollary of that is that if we live in a secular society, and I think that to live in a secular society is to live in a society that is fundamentally shaped by Christian, and in British context, Protestant assumptions, then the effectiveness of that depends on disguising its Christian character. So if people can say to Jews or Muslims or Hindus, you live in a secular society, therefore all religions are treated equal, that's a really Protestant way of seeing things. And the fact that it is still framed as the division between church and state. You don't say synagogue and state, you don't say mosque and state. But I think that is a problem then for those moments, key moments in national life, where the overtly, if you want to use the word sectarian, Protestant character of the state, I think that's a real problem. And I think it is a kind of an issue, therefore, for the Church of England. Because what does the Church of England do? Does it affirm its distinctively Protestant character, as Fox would have done, the notion that the Church of England is it's true to God's purposes, or does it dissolve itself into the kind of broader secular mush of that is the kind of the current orthodoxy of how our society should organize itself? And I suspect that it's opting for the latter course.
Yeah. And We'll look at some of those themes this afternoon when we look at the theme of transcendence and the relationship between the Church of England and some of the wider kind of other religious communities as well. I want to move on to something slightly more modern, which was the coronation of last year. And I guess many people were surprised at how religious it was. As I said a moment ago, we hadn't seen one for 70 years, and so it was like a bit of a surprise to pretty well everyone, apart from those who were in their 90s, who could have just about remembered the last one. And I guess my question is, how did you react to that kind of religious nature of the coronation? Did you feel this feels anachronistic, a bit of a hangover from the past, or did it still express something really quite important about sort of national life, about the role of Christian faith and the church in the nation?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I loved it in the way that I would have loved seeing a triceratops roam across a Dorset field. I love old things. I love things that are deeply rooted in the past. And to see a ritual that, you know, the current order of service goes back to the reign of King Edgar in the 10th century, but in turn draws on foreshadowings that go back to, to the Carolingians and back ultimately to, to the Iron Age, to the age of Solomon. I thought it was absolutely fantastic.
Was it just a dinosaur though?
Well, so this is the question. I also felt, I feel that we are kind of living through a process of cultural and moral change at the moment that is analogous to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And it felt a bit like manifestations of Catholic culture in the reign of Henry VIII. He's broken with Rome, but he's still he's still essentially Catholic. But you have the sense of the kind of the hot Protestant Reformation of his son kind of looming around the corner. And I slightly felt that watching Charles give his coronation oaths, because what I know of William, he doesn't seem a man who is greatly interested in this kind of thing. The Queen obviously was a very, very committed Anglican. And all her Christmas messages would always foreground the Christian message. The King likewise is famous for his interest in religion and indeed all kinds of spiritualities. I don't get the sense that William is. And in that sense, William may be a king more in tune with a country that basically, in a decade or 2 decades or whenever he is crowned, will have slipped the moorings of Christianity even more. And one of the reasons for that, I just want to get this out again, because I always say this every time I speak to a communion of Anglicans. One of the reasons for that is that despite the Church of England running large numbers of schools, they do not seem to be inculcating a familiarity with the Bible in generations. And so generations are growing up at the moment with a complete ignorance of the most basic fundamentals of biblical stories. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not, whether you're an Anglican, a Catholic, a Jew, a Muslim, whatever. I really do think that if you're going to have a sense of communion with the history and politics and culture of this country, a basic familiarity with the Bible would be incredibly helpful, but it is what it is. And I think that the implications for a ritual that is founded on the coronation of Solomon, of that, another 10 or 20 years where people have no idea who Solomon is, I think it will be more of a challenge.
Thank you. And just one last question before we go to our some other contributions. It's sometimes said that the only 2 countries in the world that have clerics involved in its government are Iran and Britain. We have bishops in the House of Lords. We spoke about that earlier on. And I guess the question is there any ongoing justification for that in a modern democracy? One which, as you say, is in the process of slipping its Christian moorings. And also, what do you think? Would you have any advice for bishops in Parliament? Sometimes perhaps the Church of England lacks a bit of confidence in its public role. What are the kind of things that bishops and others should be doing in that public role? And its opportunity to speak in the public life?
I feel I'm woefully unqualified to advise bishops. I mean, I guess I think that, again, it devolves to this question that seems to me to be confronting the Church of England in its public pronouncements and its national role all the time, which is, does it affirm its distinctiveness, the sense that it is the embodiment and expression of God's purpose, or is it part of a kind of, is it the kind of the religious wing of multiculturalism? And I don't know what the solution to that is. It seems both options seem to me fairly invidious, because in the one way you are kind of proclaiming a sectarian identity that will not go down well, and on the other hand you lose everything that makes the church distinctive. So both options seem to me tricky to negotiate. I think the one reason for one brilliant reason for keeping bishops in the House of Lords is that it's so annoying to humanists. And we're talking about the legacy of the Civil War. The kind of regular the sight of humanists deploying the Britain is just like Iran argument is a glorious testimony to the enduring hold of Civil War polemics. Earnest moral hostility to bishops still has a place, even in 21st century England.
And just to follow up on that last question, this, I guess, is more general about Christian witness in the current climate. One, I guess, your arguments about in Dominion is that actually we are far more Christian than we realise, even secular Britain. And so in a context where actually kind of Christian faith is, as you argue, pretty well everywhere, what has the church to say that is distinctive?
Exactly, and I think that's the problem, because I think in a way that the church has been too successful. Over the course of the 20th century, lots of what traditionally, ever since the Roman Empire, the church had been providing, whether it was help for the poor or education or health or whatever, came to be nationalised. And I think that now what's happened is that its core teachings likewise have been nationalised and rebranded and repackaged as just being the way that people think. Just be kind. And people don't tend to think where this comes from. And the risk then for the church is if you say, well, actually, that's ours, people will say bigot. So it's a real problem.
Yeah.